Hey guys, it's Kevin again. This is my review for the other Starz show that premiered this summer, known as Sweetbitter. And what Sweetbitter essentially about is we center on the character of Tess, and she is someone who she's just now gotten into New York basically to get a head start, and she ends up working at this very prestigious restaurant basically to get direction, and along the way she, starts to get entangled with a bunch of other characters and starts to realize that this might be a much more complicated situation than she thought, and that's really all I'm going to say. So Sweetbitter in general, I was actually really looking forward to this show. This show looked really interesting. It had a really great cast overall, and especially Starz, I really thought this could be a very sort of addicting show for them. There really aren't too many shows out there that deal with restaurants and things like that. And I was definitely looking forward to this one more than Vita. The ironic thing is that, unlike Vita, I really wasn't that big of a fan of this show. Now, don't get me wrong, Sweetbitter is not a bad show, but it is a very safe derivative show that we have seen 1,000 times before and really doesn't do anything that different, but we're just getting to right now, starting off with the cast. And I will say right off the bat, there's a lot of problems with this show. The cast is not one of them. The cast really does do as good as a job as I think they could possibly do. Particularly our main star here, Purnell, actually does do a fairly good job as a character of Tess. Now, the character we'll get to a little bit later, but she adds a lot of layers to this character overall. Tess is someone who, she's very much like the audience. She's very unfamiliar with this environment, and she doesn't really understand what she's getting herself into, and a lot of this first season is her just getting exposed to the restaurant business and her getting enriched in, New York culture and things like that and all that kind of stuff. And I really did like going into that with her character. I think Purnell does add a lot more layers to this character overall. You can definitely see that she's someone who she is very sort of quiet and reserved, and I think overall she did a really great job on the show. Again, not a huge fan of her character. We'll get to her character a little bit later, but I do think Purnell overall did a really good job and definitely does have potential as an actress for sure. And then really the only other standout of this first season is FitzGerald as the character of Simone, who this character is very intriguing. The moment we meet her, she's very private about her life, but there's always something really sort of alluring about her. You don't really know what's up with her, but Tess is incredibly fascinated by this character. She is very much a sort of like mentor figure towards her in this first season, but you also feel there's something kind of intimidating about her, and the relationship between these two is easily one of the best parts of this first season. I thought these two had really great chemistry, and one of the best episodes of the season is just these two, and I think they did a really great job with that budding, relationship overall, and I'm very interested in seeing where it does go heading into the next season. And then the rest of the cast here does do a fairly admirable job. Tom Sturridge is Jake. I thought he definitely was pretty good here. Paul Sparks is Howard. Of course, he's good. He's a very good actor. And Howard is someone who he's very dedicated to this restaurant business overall. And he really is trying to do what he can to keep it afloat. And I definitely did like his character. But someone else I do want to highlight is Daniyar. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He did a really great job as the character of Sasha. Sasha is this person who at first really clashes with Tess, but very quickly becomes one of her most trusted allies, and I really did like the friendship between these two overall. I think, like I said, the cast as a whole, they do a good job. They do work well together. It just really is unfortunate when it comes to the rest of the show. So now we get to what is easily the more problematic problems with this show, and that is the directing and the writing. Now, I will say, the tone for the show is fine. It is a show that it is actually very subtle, but then there are moments where it is a little bit over the top, and the tone is not really what bothered me here. That's not really a huge problem. I don't really have too many things to say when it comes to the directing. I do think it's well directed overall, the drama and things like that. There are some really nice, subtle moments throughout the show, and I do think it was well done. The show is very much hampered, though, by these really over-the-top, sort of soapy moments, and it does feel a bit tonally unbalanced at points. I will definitely give the show that, but that's not really the thing that bothered me. The problem with the show is easily the writing, which the writing on the show is really very lifeless, honestly, and I think the biggest problem is that there just really isn't a lot happening in this first season. And again, I'm going to compare this show to Vita a lot. And not just because it follows, directly after Vita, but it has the same exact formula as Vita, where it only has 6 episodes to tell a story. And while Vita really just got right into it and gave us a really fairly compelling story about 2 very different sisters who come from the same background and try to accept their mother's death and, get acclimated to the culture and things like that. Sweetbitter doesn't really do that at all. If anything, Sweetbitter is what I thought Vita was going to be, which is, like I said, kind of directionless. It just doesn't really have many places to go, and the biggest problem with the show is our main character. Tess as a character, Ella Purnell's performance aside, just isn't very interesting. From the moment we meet her, we have no connection to her whatsoever. We don't know why she's in New York. We don't know anything about her past. We don't even know why she really wants to become, a backwaiter. What is her real aspirations? What does she really want to do here? What has her past been? 6 episodes in, we still don't know anything about this character. And look, it would be one thing if they were maybe subtle about it and they gave us some clues as to what she's been through, but they don't even do that. In 6 episodes, she doesn't really go through much of an arc. She starts off and she's very hesitant about whether or not she really wants to enter this work, and she ends the season in the exact same place. And again, the problem with this character is that I wouldn't have a huge problem if they didn't devote so much time to who does she want to be with and what does she really want to do as a backwaiter, because again, we don't know anything about her, and they spend so much time on this romantic drama that I just really didn't give a shit about. I don't care about the relationship between her and Jake. I don't care about how she feels with Will, because again, I don't know anything about this character. I have no reason to care for her. Why am I gonna care who she wants to be with? I mean, that's just the thing that the show is so confused about. You have to get us, you have to get us somewhat engaged in a character in order to, identify with them and want them to end up with this person and want them to be happy. I don't even know what I want for Tess as a character, because again, we don't know anything about her, and again, Pernell is definitely trying, but she cannot save this character. She cannot save the bland, very, like I said, lifeless sort of writing this character does have. I mean, again, it's not like Tess is completely robotic or anything. She definitely does have emotions, but there's no consistency with this character. You don't really feel like this character undergoes much of anything, and I just didn't really feel like there was any growth in her, and I really did want that, and again, that was very much missing. And again, for me, this would not be as much of a problem if the show maybe did what Riverdale Season 1 did, where they realized, okay, the main character isn't very interesting, let's take the time to flesh out the ensemble. And while the show does try to do that, they really don't. The main characters that this show does focus on this first season is very Tess-centric, but it also does focus a lot on Simone and Jake. And while the show does that, it really is only in 1 or 2 episodes where we really do get, a lot of fleshing out of Simone's character. Like I said, Simone is this very intriguing, sort of mysterious presence, and where she ends up going in this first season did not feel earned. It did not feel like that was the place where they needed to take her character. Jake as a character, there just isn't really much with him. All we know about Jake is that him and Simone have this really weird sort of relationship where she's kind of like this maternal figure in his life, and she's sort of like his mother, but there's something else going on there. We really don't know much about him. We don't really know much about the character of Will either. The only character in the show who I felt had a fully well-realized arc was Sasha. Sasha is a character who we realize, throughout the season that he, is kind of like an outsider in the restaurant. We eventually realize that he does want to become a server, but he doesn't really have the qualifications that Howard wants for him to do that. And he starts to wonder if it is like a gender thing or if it's because of his sexuality, and he feels very much, marginalized because of that. He feels very much like he is being, he's being left in the dust. And where this character ends up going was really great. But again, I should mention, this all happens in the course of like 27 minutes, and there's only 6 episodes in this season, and they really could have given more time to flesh out his character a lot more. Given the fact that they had those limited amount of episodes, I think it would have been a wise choice to dive more into these characters, and they really don't. And again, the problem is that the first season is so Tess heavy that she really does overtake most of the season, and it just doesn't really work, unfortunately. And again, I'm not going to give the excuse of, oh, this show had 6 episodes, they didn't have enough, because they certainly did. Vita was able to tell a story in 6 episodes. This show somehow wasn't. This show is not telling that much of a story, and it just didn't really do much of anything in terms of the characters. Also, the restaurant setting here. Now, look, I am going to be very picky about this part, because I don't know if you guys know, but I've actually worked in a restaurant for over 6 months now, so I know all the ins and outs of how the restaurant business works and things like that, and I understand this is a different restaurant than where I work at. I work at the Cheesecake Factory, and this is definitely a different type of restaurant than that. But this did not feel that realistic in terms of that. I mean, the only characters that Tess really ends up interacting with are people in the bar and people who are also back waiters. Why didn't she ever interact with a busser? Why didn't she ever meet up with a dessert maker? I mean, there's other positions in a restaurant besides these 2, but the show is so focused on just being a back waiter that it doesn't really want to dive into, really what being in the restaurant business is all about. They don't really do much of anything with that setting. And to me, it seems like you could honestly take that setting out and the show would still be the same. It felt very gimmicky in that sense, and they didn't do much of anything with the restaurant. And I heard in the book, this is much more used as sort of like a metaphor, and they use a lot of the different sort of coatings of the smells and things like that, and the different tastes as ways to emphasize Tess's character. Here, it felt very much more like a backdrop, and that this is only here because this is what Tess is doing in this moment, and it just really didn't work, and I don't really think they did anything with the restaurant business. There are parts of this show that did feel familiar in that sense, but again, they just didn't really do much with it, and I was definitely disappointed there. And going back to the characters, like I said, there just really isn't much there with them, unfortunately. Hell, in the last episode, there are 2 characters in the show that pop up, and I'm just now starting to learn their names. I'm just now realizing who they are, and it wouldn't be a problem if these 2 characters weren't the main characters of the show. These are 2 people who are in the main cast, and I'm still struggling to remember, what is that girl's name? What is that girl's name? What is their purpose here? Why are they on the show? I didn't even think they were introduced. I really didn't, because again, they don't do anything with them. There are a lot of characters like that this season. That very much did disappoint me, especially given how, like I said, dull and boring our main character is. You would have thought they would take the time to flesh out the other characters, and they just simply don't. I will say the cinematography on the show is quite great. I do think there are some really great shots in this show, but again, it's very standard. They don't really do much with it. There are some cool sequences here and there with Tess's character. Episode 2 is probably the most artsy of the bunch, because it's basically channeling like one horrible night in Tess's life, and there's a lot of like metaphorical stuff in that episode, but again, they just don't really do much with it, and I didn't feel as connected to Tess's character, and that whole episode felt like it would be episode 6 or something like that. It felt like an episode that would work if we knew who Tess was, and we just simply don't. The score, again, didn't really do much of anything, and the editing. I'm sorry, I have to say this, but Vita worked to 6 episodes, and I just don't think this show does. I think this show would have benefited a lot more if this was a 10-episode season. We could have dived a lot more into Tess's character. We could have gotten some clues about her. I'm not saying you need to reveal everything. I'm not saying that. I understand that you want to keep your character a mystery. You want to keep your character compelling. Hell, Legion, last season of Legion, the entire first season of Legion was us establishing David's character, and was basically like a prologue. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend has done this. BoJack Horseman. There are numerous shows that have not revealed too much about a character and still keep them compelling. Tess, on the other hand, there's just really nothing to latch onto with her, and I think if they would have had in more episodes, they really could have taken the time to dive more into her character, and they just simply didn't, and it was definitely a huge letdown in that regard. Also, something else that many of you might be very confused about, this show is technically a period piece, and I know for those of you who've seen the show, would you be shocked if I told you the show took place in 2006? Yeah, me too. Why? Because they do absolutely nothing with this. The only reason I think they put the show in 2006 is because they wanted to stay faithful to the book. And I understand you want to give as accurate of an adaptation as possible. I'm totally all for that. I don't read books or anything, but I know people who are book nerds and, very much into books and things like that. They want things to stay accurate. They want things to be like the book. They don't like deviations. They want things to be as accurate as possible. But for me, it seemed like the only reason they did this is because of the book. You honestly could have set this in modern times, and I think the show would be exactly the same. The show doesn't do anything with its 2006 setting. It doesn't incorporate any sort of lack of technology or anything like that. It just feels so arbitrary, and a lot of things in the show feel very arbitrary, and that's one of them. And like I said, guys, there's really nothing wrong with the show being a bit slow-paced. I have no problem with that. A lot of shows that I love are very slow-paced. The problem is with this show, it's unnecessarily slow. It's slow to the point where it doesn't feel like anything is happening. Especially, like I said, from episodes 1 to 6, it just doesn't feel like we really treaded that much ground at all, and it really did feel like it was missing that purpose that really did keep the show watchable. And for me, there really just wasn't much there. But now, guys, I do want to get into some spoilers, which there's really not a lot that happens in the first season. I'm mainly going to talk about what happens in the finale, and I think, how weird of a direction it really was. And if you guys haven't seen Sweetbitter, I don't really recommend it, but the only reason that you should watch it is because it is a Starz show, and it follows Vita, and you might be intrigued, I guess. So if you're going to watch the show, just don't watch the rest of this video. But like I said, I'm mainly going to talk about what does go down in the finale. This finale was both disappointing but also intriguing. It was intriguing in the sense that they did give us a little bit more to some of these characters, particularly Howard. I like that in this episode we did get more into Howard's character, how he was at a bit of a loss after his wife died, and he's kind of been struggling to pick up the pieces ever since then, and his head hasn't been in the right place. Again, this is all good and done, but if they would have given us more of this throughout the season, I would have cared about Howard's character a lot more. Howard, throughout most of the season, was just this creepy guy who was working the restaurants and that I always felt uncomfortable watching. This Howard feels a lot more down to earth. This Howard feels like, okay, that makes sense. He was very overbearing because that was the only thing in his life that kind of gave him purpose, and he's kind of been struggling for that. But again, he didn't really have much of an arc, so this kind of felt like it was coming out of nowhere. And then Simone easily, I think, is the biggest problem with this episode, because for me, obviously we did have the parallel with Simone and Serena, and how Serena was this former server, and we knew there was some tension between the two, but when we realized Simone is actually sleeping with Serena's that one guy in the restaurants, I just didn't really feel much of anything. It's supposed to feel like this big moment where Tess finally stops looking at, Simone with admiration, and she stops looking at her as a way where she wants, someone to emulate, and I didn't really feel much of anything, because I felt like we were just starting to get to know Simone's character, and it just really didn't feel like that big of a moment. What felt even more weird is when we get to that conversation between Simone and Jake, and we realize that this isn't a healthy relationship at all. If anything, Simone is incredibly controlling and very overbearing, and, basically wants to have full attention. She doesn't want him to be with anyone else. The problem with this is, if Simone feels this ownership over Jake, why is she going off with other guys? Why is she going off and having sex with them? Now, we understand with Howard, most likely she did that in an effort to keep Jake around, but it just didn't really make much sense. This is just a really weird relationship overall, and I'm just not really a huge fan of it. And again, the way the show ends with Simone now being a bit more pessimistic towards Tess and trying to, you know, intimidate her. It just did not feel like a very natural shift for the character. We hadn't really gotten into Simone all that much. All we knew about Simone was, like I said, the relationship between her and Jake and how she was so protective of him, and I think we should have taken the whole season to flesh that out. And then if they would have given us more time, then this would have felt like a big reveal. Then this would have felt like something interesting, and it just really didn't. It didn't really go anywhere. And like I said, Tess, she doesn't really go through anything in this episode. She is just as on the fence as being in this job as she was in the first few episodes of this show. And I just didn't really feel like she went through much of anything. I really thought they were going to give us more information about Tess's character, who she really was, where she maybe came from. Just give us a clue or something. And they really didn't give us anything. And I just really wanted more. This finale was somewhat intriguing, but it didn't really make me want to watch the show that much more than I already did have a desire to. So like I said, guys, Sweetbitter in general just really didn't do much for me. This is a show that feels very empty. It feels like it's missing a lot, and it really does feel like it's missing that connection to its main character. There are some interesting things in here for sure with some of the characters, and the performances do elevate it to a level where the show's not ever boring, but the story and things like that, there just really isn't a lot happening, and I really did want more from the show. It didn't really give us that much into the restaurant business. It didn't really get us more into these characters. And again, when you have a character like Tess who just isn't that interesting, it definitely does make me lose a lack of engagement, and it really did not make me that interested in the show. To be honest, the only reason I really watched the show is because it was 6 episodes and that it followed Vita. That's the only reason I really watched the show. I don't really know if the show is gonna get a second season. I have not really heard too many people talk about it, and to be honest, I don't really know if I'm that interested in a second season. This show, like I said, really disappointed me. I wanted a lot more from it, and in the end, it ended up being one of the most forgettable and just meaningless things I think I've seen all year. There really is nothing about this show that I really would recommend other than those few performances. It really doesn't do much of anything, and I think you're much better, you know, you're much better off watching something like Vita, and I think that's just a much better show overall. The show does have potential. I think it does. It definitely does have room to grow, but I just feel like given what they did this season, I would not be surprised they continue to just not really do much of anything with these characters, and I just don't really care all that much about. So unfortunately, while I really did want to enjoy this show, it just really did not work for me, and I am going to give the first season of Sweetbitter overall a C. Like I said, guys, didn't hate the show or anything, but it just felt so lifeless and forgettable, and it just didn't do much of anything for me. And I really just wanted more from these characters. The finale ends it in a place where it could get interesting, but I just really need more from the show overall. I need more with our main character. I need more connection to the restaurant. I just need a lot more urgency that this first season was really lacking. But either way, guys, for this review, hope you guys enjoy. I'll see you guys in my next video, and I will see you guys for that. Okay, bye.